What's new, 802? I'm Becca Hammond, and you're listening to Vermont Talks. Vermont Talks may include graphic or explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. Today I'm talking with a Montreal Paul. He's a singer, a songwriter, and a musician. Let's get to it. Paul, welcome on the show.
Why, thank you.
So, please tell me what name you like to go by.
Okay. Well, it depends on the context, obviously.
I was going to say, I've seen 3 different names, so I want you to tell everybody what you prefer.
Well, all right. So, I'm originally from Montreal. Those are where my roots are, really. So, and I thought it would be clever to go by the stage name of a Montreal Paul, which I still do. But my actual name is Paul Beaulieu. Paul Edward Henri Beaulieu, if we want to be really precise.
Very French.
Oh, yeah.
It makes sense if you're from Montreal.
Yes. My mother was from England, but yes, my langue maternelle c'est l'anglais. But so I grew up in English, but my family name is French, and I'm not sure why I decided to adopt that stage name, but one reason is that, for example, around these parts, and also other times when I lived in the United States, I noticed that people had a lot of difficulty pronouncing it. My last name, that is to say.
I was going to say, a lot of people butcher those names. Yeah. And being in Vermont, it's funny because a lot of people have French last names. They butcher. And it's a little funny hearing the different pronunciations.
Well, like Boucher would be butcher.
Oh, right. And the one name that I've heard pronounced, I think probably 6 different ways. Messier. I've heard Messier. I've heard 16 different pronunciations.
And it's got to the point where those are the pronunciations now, because that's how people are known. They know themselves as that now because it's been a few generations. There was a big migration. I mean, this is getting a little off topic, but there was a fairly sizable migration down to states like New England, so Vermont and other states in New England. And so that's why there's a lot of these. Actually, if you go up to the Old North End, you'll see engraved in one of the buildings, you'll see that used to be a French school.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all.
But it's been a while, so.
Yeah, both my grandparents spoke fluent French in this area. That was very normal. I knew people who didn't speak English as a primary language in their own home in Vermont.
Yeah, because this, strange as it might seem, this area was industrialized before Quebec. So that a lot of people came down from Quebec to work in the mills.
That makes a lot of sense.
Back in the days when there were a lot of mills around.
I went to school in Richford, and Richford, back in the day, it's definitely not the same thriving place it used to be, but they used to have a lot of factories, and it was a hot spot on the border that both Vermonters would head north and the Canadians would come south. And
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's definitely easier to pronounce. People see the word Montreal, and they know how to say Montreal. Yeah. And I wanted to just point out, I missed a Montreal Paul. I missed the A at first, and I love the A because it's very subtle, but it's a great touch.
Yeah, it's because I'm just one of them, you see. No.
That's it. I'm sure there are several Montreal Pauls.
Well, there's a few in my family, in fact. Well, there's at least one other that I know of. I think he's passed away. Yeah, anyway. But, there are a number of Paul Beaulieus around, too. So, yeah.
Yes, I think I've met some before, to be honest. Up in Franklin, we have a lot of... I feel like half the names are French up in that area along the border.
I would be interested to know how it's pronounced there, because I'm pretty sure it's not Beaulieu, but, it's... When I lived for a while in New York City, and, the pronunciations that I heard of my last name were interesting to behold.
That's why I asked you first, because I didn't want to butcher your name. So tell me as much detail as you would like to give, your life story. How did you go from point A to point B?
Oh, yes. Well, I grew up in Montreal, and I even went to university there. So And
which one? Just
I went to McGill.
Nice, cool.
I studied philosophy and library science. Anyway, then went to New York for a couple. Well, actually, yeah, I went to New York for a couple of years and worked there, and then I came back. But when I was, it was when I was living in New York that I actually started writing songs. You see, didn't play any instrument. I see you've got a bunch of instruments here, actually, but yes. I didn't play any instruments at all. It was all a cappella. For some reason, I found New York to be a bit. Well, I'm kind of a nervous person anyway, I suppose. And for some reason, I found living in New York anxiety-inducing. And
I don't think you're the only person who's said that before. Yeah. I immediately think of the Jim Croce song. I don't know why, but New York's not my home.
Oh, I don't know that one. I've heard of Jim Croce, but I'm not familiar with that particular tune.
The theme, what you just expressed, is very much the theme. It's anxiety-inducing.
I mean, there was a lot that was like really fabulous about New York in some ways. Like, it's just amazing to actually see it. You know, it's like you're seeing things that I normally see in movies and things.
Right.
But, or TV shows, but yeah. But living there does wear on the old nervous system, I find. And I found this is a weird story, actually. I found myself like walking down the street and going, oh, trying to calm myself down. Oh, no.
Hey, anything that works, because you know, like, you might see something crazy walking down the street of New York. Yeah.
And I started making up tunes, and I'd already, actually, even when I was in college, I'd started like writing. I suppose you could call it poetry. Anyway.
Right. Well, it makes sense if you're thinking, like, philosophy is a thinking major. Words, thoughts, all those things. It lends to poetry. I can see that being. Yeah,
it was sort of, and some of my songs are sort of philosophically inclined even today, I suppose. But anyway, so then I started, coming up with tunes. So then I started, okay, well, let me see if I can sing some of these words. And I had like a cassette player and so on. I was like singing. And I was into harmony, so I would try and like play a cassette in the background while also singing over it, a harmony over it. And I have recordings of some of these things, and they sound atrocious because the sound quality is absolutely terrible. And also, they weren't necessarily well executed. But I think one of the things about when you're starting out doing something, and also when you're playing an instrument, as I found when I was playing the guitar later, because that comes later, it's best if you can hear the potential in what you're doing, rather than just the actuality of what you're doing. Because if what you're hearing is just the actuality of what you're doing, you realize that what you're doing is crap, and there's really no point in doing it anymore.
Right, it's discouraging.
Yes. So I listen to these things now, and it's like, what is this?
Oh, I love that sentence. I just have to give you kudos for that sentence. The potential in the sound. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, if you just hear the potential, then that's a problem, because then you don't realize that you really need to improve. But
yes,
but if you need some balance there, I think.
Yeah, very true. That's fascinating. I love hearing the way people think.
Yeah,
what a great sentence. Oh, okay. So New York.
Then I came back to Montreal, and my mother got a guitar like some years earlier, but she never really played it. It was like one of those things where you sort of like, you get some, you might get something, or you might get art supplies or something like that. You think, you know what, I'm really going to do this. I'm going to make a hobby out of this, and so on. And it never quite pans out.
Yeah, that happens to a lot of people. Those non-starter hobbies that it's just not.
I've had a few of those.
Quite what you think it's going to be, or a lot of people are just ADHD. I have a million hobbies, and it's like, oh, I'm going to do this one this week.
Yeah.
And then I start something and forget it for 6 months, and then pick it up again 6 months later.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely have experienced the guitar hobby. Many people have a guitar in their home.
Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I sort of picked it up, and because I had these, I had these songs, and it was like, okay, well, what am I going to do with these? I can't really just stand up and sing them. So And that's how I ended up learning. And strangely enough, speaking of that, I do remember that my parents actually got me musical instruments years earlier, but I never really took to them. So
it can be really weird when you're young
yeah.
and you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and I really didn't. Also, I had the idea that the way you learn music is you have to learn musical notation and all that, and for some reason that just really intimidated me. So I had trouble with that. But yeah. Anyway, once I'd gotten, I'd gone back to Montreal and I had the guitar, and so I was just playing around with it. It took a while for me to learn it, and so again, the potential stuff versus the actuality, but
yeah, it takes everyone. I don't think anyone picks up a guitar and gets it in the first year. Like they don't really get. They're going through the motions, but that muscle memory is not there. Like there's a certain point that you hit that you're like, I get it. Like I can pick it up and I get it. And it takes so long. And a lot of people, they don't want to struggle through the pain.
Well, yeah. Also, it's just with the chords and everything like that, and just moving the fingers around and knowing where to move them at the right. Like there were chords there are chords that even now I don't really do because they're just too hard for me. But
100%, some of those bar chords are a pain. Yeah. Even if you've got it 90%, it's still buzzing for some reason.
Or you get these undertones, which are kind of unpleasant.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's a string that's not being held down quite right, so you get it's muffled, but you get the wrong tone in there.
Right.
And it doesn't sound right.
Oh yeah, you can play. I've been playing guitar. I don't even like thinking about it. It's been over 12 years.
Yeah.
13, 14. I don't even that's what I'm saying. I don't like thinking about it. I don't want to add it up, but that's it. I'll still struggle. You're still learning. Music's constant learning game.
Well, that is very true. And I think that's actually one of the keys to songwriting and creativity in general when it comes to music is that you are always learning. Because one of my routes to writing a composition, quite often is just sitting around trying to figure something out. Sometimes I'll play with a different tuning, or it's just like a chord that I don't quite, sort of like, oh, if I put my fingers here, I get this. What can I do with that?
Right.
So, and it's a way to not be trapped in the same sort of patterns too much. So.
Yes, that's definitely a thing. I think most musicians fall into little ruts here and there.
And I do too, but it's good to find ways out of them so you're not always in there. So.
Right. Yeah, it's insane. Some people get in a rut and they stay there their whole life. Yeah. They'll never learn new chords. They play 4 chords. and they're multi-millionaire musicians, some of them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'll say this, that, I do know, I've seen and known people who, they play like bluegrass or stuff like that. And that stuff's like just 3 chords all the way through. It's very, in one way it's just really repetitive. A lot of the songs sound the same, but of course if the musicians are really good, then it still sounds really interesting because they play all these kind of like solos and fills and all that. So it's like, it's really interesting. So I'm not going to say that, I mean, there's chords. There's other ways to make it interesting. For me, I do tend to put in a fair number of chords because, I'm not that's just the way I kind of think about it, I think. But, there's different ways, certainly more in the folk tradition, there tends to be fewer chords because, for various reasons.
Right. Right. Yes, there's a lot of different reasons that people get stuck in those ruts. Bluegrass is interesting. It's cool that you brought that up. There's so many different picking patterns in that you can't even tell that it is the same chord in some ways. You can tell it's the same key. Yeah. But you almost don't notice that, hey, they haven't really moved this hand in 5 minutes because this hand's been going crazy.
Yeah, well, especially with the mandolin and so forth. I mean, the bass is kind of like boom, 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 boom all the way through, so it's not so interesting. maybe,
yes,
but the mandolin is
songs.
Like, or if they got a fiddler in there or whatever, it's like
fiddle's so cool. I love fiddle. I wish I could play fiddle, but I'm terrified to terrify my neighbors. Okay, so I wanted to ask you some more questions.
Okay.
We kind of talked about what inspired you to make music a little, but did you want to embellish at all on that?
Well, inspiration's an ongoing thing, and I don't know where this started to happen, but I think it's probably true with a lot of musicians too, is that part of the process is that you start listening to other people's music differently. You don't necessarily do it consciously, but looking back, I feel like at a certain point I started thinking maybe a little more analytically about what was going on in some of this music. And I think that's important because then, if there's a song or a piece that you really like, you start to, you think, well, what is it about it that I really like? Of course, when you're starting out too, sometimes you can come a little close to just copying it. But I think one of the good things about not being too skilled a musician, if I may put it like that, is that you can't necessarily copy things too closely because,
right.
You might have the ambition to just capture what they were doing there, but you can't do it in the same way because you're not the same person. You don't have the same skill set necessarily.
Right.
So
that's interesting. That's true. That definitely is a thing.
So part of it is just listening to what you're interested in, what you admire, and so on. And I could talk about my musical influences, but I've got quite a lot of them. So
I noticed that you have a lot of music online.
Yeah,
an impressive amount of music online.
Yeah,
and it seems like you have a love for the Woodstock era rock musicians in some ways. I call it Woodstock era. I grew up on classic rock.
Yeah, it was what people might call classic rock, yeah.
Which is a term that is very quickly morphing and meaning many different things to many people, because now 90s rock is considered classic rock. So I've started saying Woodstock era rock to put it somewhat in the early 70s era, late 60s, somewhere in that zone.
Yeah, in Montreal, the classic rock station was shown. Of course, they mainly focused on the 70s, but even then they were playing 90s stuff. I don't know what they're doing now, but when you consider what is called oldies now, it's like stuff from the 80s now is oldies.
Oh yeah, I heard. Apparently, this is blowing my mind. It's horrifying me. Apparently, 2000s metal is being referred to as dad rock. And I'm kind of like, what?
Well, I guess there are young dads who grew up on that stuff. I don't know.
That's it. They've got kids that are 12 plus, and
like, Dad, don't play that.
Oh yeah, I just can't. I'm shocked at some of the music they were calling like dad rock. Like, this is good stuff. This isn't even old. What do you mean? Now I feel old.
Yeah, it happens to all of us eventually.
But anyway, your music, it's very whimsical. I love it. I love the feeling of it. I don't know exactly what to compare it to. Yeah. You did a couple early Pink Floyd covers though, and honestly, I think that's
an influence. Whimsical, Syd Barrett. Yeah, that's an influence. For those who don't know, Pink Floyd had a beginning where they had somebody else as the front man, and he sort of left early on. But
and
his was a sort of whimsical style.
They were so experimental in those early albums, and it was so cool. There's something about it reminds me of the Beatles, the way the Beatles were playing around, and there's so many other musicians in the 60s that were doing, just out there interesting experimental stuff and putting poetry to music, and just it's so cool. And that's what it evokes in my mind. I was like, it's funny that you're doing early Pink Floyd, because even your other songs, I was feeling it.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's an influence, and also through other people, like another singer-songwriter who I would sort of compare him, Robin Hitchcock. He's also influenced by early Pink Floyd and Syd Barrett. Oh, hello. And it's almost like having influences in common. But I've listened to a lot of his stuff also. So, and he's done like a lot of he does different kinds of things, but maybe some of his acoustic stuff has influenced me quite a lot about how I think about things acoustically. Because one of the questions that you gave me earlier on was about how I would categorize the music. That's kind of always a tricky one for me. Like I was thinking, maybe like freak folk or something like that is a kind of category that.
Right.
But although again, I don't necessarily think of it as folk, just because. I mean, you could think of it as folk because it's kind of acoustic guitar based.
Right.
But I tend to think of folk as sort of like traditional music. Sort of like,
yes, the way they sing. There's something about a folk singer that you're not a folk singer.
No,
but
I don't see myself as that.
Yeah, and I don't hear that either. But I can kind of hear the guitar leaning towards a folk sort of sound. But it really does remind me of funky early Pink Floyd, where they were experimenting with these. Like rhythmically, there was a lot. It's just interesting. You have a lot of interesting stuff going on for it, and it's not like you kind of pointed out earlier. You're not Rush. The progressive rock doesn't have to just be for people who are playing insanely
like really technically
fast,
really technically proficient. Yeah,
right.
I heard recently Rush's drummer, I believe, passed away, and they were talking about
Neil Peart.
Yeah, Neil Peart. Of course, he was he's a renowned drummer.
And lyricist, too.
Yeah,
he wrote some beautiful songs. So. I very much love Peart. I'm very sad about that. Yeah.
But, I wasn't that familiar with Rush, although they did play. I think they played maybe more Rush than here, in Montreal than they would.
Right.
Here because of the CanCon regulations that they have in Canada. Radio stations are supposed to play a certain amount of Canadian content. Of course, Rush being a Canadian band, they got a fair bit of airplay in Canada, and especially on classic rock stations.
Yes, I grew up listening to Shom. That was I love Shom, and Terry's actually retiring, and it's blowing my mind. Oh. They're doing I don't know, it might be done now, but they were doing a month of Terry DeMonte.
I think I heard a bit about that, but.
Yeah, I was because I guess he's been there since basically the beginning.
He was definitely there. Yeah, he's been there for a long time. So, and they started in the early 1970 or something like that.
Yes, they've been
1969, 1970. And you hear stories about what it was like in the early days, and it sounds very different from what it is now.
Oh yeah,
but I guess there are some people who are still around, so they managed through all the changes there.
Yes, that's a great station, and they very much played a lot of Rush.
Yeah,
I've heard a lot of Rush in my life, and it's probably mostly due to Shom, to be honest. Because I think I knew the lyrics before I went to grade school, because I used to just listen to it in the dairy. Like, we had a barn, and we just listened to Shom all the time in the barn. And they would play so much Rush that, like I said...
Were you, near the border?
Right on the border.
Okay, because, you don't necessarily get Shom here.
No, we're actually the Pinnacle, Sutton in Quebec. We're right on the other side of Sutton. Yep. So my farm was literally at the foot of the Pinnacle on the Vermont side. Yeah, definitely the middle of nowhere. But we got good Shom reception.
Well, that's a plus. Yeah, I used to listen to that a fair bit. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about. Let's compare and contrast. What's different about Vermont compared to Montreal? What's good? What's bad? What's better about Montreal?
Well, one thing that immediately comes to mind is that Montreal is a big city and Vermont is not. We do have Burlington here, which is the closest we get to a big city, but it's not.
It's not a big city.
No. It's 60,000 people?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the number is, but I know that a lot of it is college kids, so the population varies a huge amount when they're not in town.
It does, and of course the fact that it is a college town does have something to do with the music scene here too, but which we can get into in a bit, I suppose. But so Montreal, and of course another difference is that it's Montreal. Montreal's more cosmopolitan in a sense. It's of course there's the French speaking aspect of it, easier to get around on public transport, although Burlington is kind of interesting as far as real small towns go because it has a fairly developed public transport system for a town of its size.
Right. I think a lot of that's because of the college kids, because they won't let them have cars.
Exactly. So, what I like about Vermont is that it is rural in a sense. I mean, Burlington to me is almost like the ideal combination of urban and rural in the sense that, like on the way over here, I ran into a bunny rabbit. It's kind of like, it's nice. You can go walking out in the woods, and for me, there's a peacefulness in being in nature, which, if you're in the middle of the city, I find it a little enervating sometimes. It's, it's a trade-off. There are things that are easier to access in a city compared to here. And certainly, if you want to go to a museum or something like that, it's...
Right. I don't know that we have a museum in Burlington. If we do, I don't think it's very big.
There is the museum on Lake Champlain.
Right, the Echo Center.
The Echo Center, but it's not really a museum per se.
Right.
There was a small one, I remember, where they had an exhibit of Alison Bechtel, I believe.
Some sort of historical museum type.
Yeah,
we have a lot of little...
It's part of the college. It's part of the college.
Okay, that makes sense.
The university, not the college, the university. But they had like this tiny little thing. I don't know what they normally had, but they had an exhibit of Alison Bechtel, which I went to see once.
Nice. Very cool.
Yes, it's, so there's those trade-offs. In terms of the music scene, there's some similarities, because one of the things about Montreal is that a lot of kids come up from the States, for example. They might come for college.
Right.
And they come, they form bands, and then that was Arcade Fire, actually. I think they're all Americans, basically, but they formed in Montreal.
That's funny. I didn't know that.
I don't know if they're all Americans, but some of them are anyway. I think one of them's from Texas.
Montreal has I think a lot of the cities in Canada have melting pot sort of vibes where you get really cool cultural infusions. Yeah. Which I feel like I've actually referred to Burlington as Little Montreal a few times because we are very small, we're very rural, but we do melting pot. We have the colleges that very much help stir the cultural pot. We have the music scene.
Yeah, well, Burlington is sort of the cultural pot of Vermont. You also, you have, Vermont is traditionally been very homogenous demographics, but the Burlington area is that's changing here, definitely.
Right. There's industry here. There's no industry anywhere else in the state. It's kind of sad how far people drive 2 hours just to get to the city, and then they'll drive 2 hours back to the middle of nowhere.
Well, you see, there's another issue, which is that of housing, and that's becoming a problem in both Montreal and it's been a problem in Burlington for some time, and it's quite serious. But actually, I heard that rents are really going up quite a bit in Montreal over the last year. For some reason, with the pandemic, they're raising rents. I don't understand the economics of that, but...
Probably something to do with inflation. I read some crazy statistic about how much money we've printed. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the States, but we've printed an alarming amount of money in the last year to keep the rate stable.
Yeah, just to keep things on even keel, because it's just been...
right, because... everything's been getting more expensive, but if they don't print money, it would run away. Like the inflation rate would go absolutely insane if they didn't keep on trying to fuel the economy with money. So we're in a precarious spot. I can understand why rent's going up, but it's really not good in all the cities from what I've heard, because I've heard it across the country too, out on the West Coast even.
Mm-hmm. And of course, rents were already... housing affordability was an issue even before, so that's something that we're going to have to sort out pretty soon, I think. But anyway, so No, I don't know how interesting that comparison was, but
It's a good comparison. It's very honest. I think that's all you can ask for, right?
Right.
So if you had to pick one thing, like your favorite thing about this area, what would it be?
I would say the nature, like just being able to.
How did I know? I was going to say the bunny rabbit.
Yeah, I find it calming, you know. As I mentioned, I have a bit of an anxiety thing going on.
It's very quiet here. It's much quieter here than in Montreal.
Yes. Also, I have to say that in the last year, I was kind of happy that I was here in some ways, just because it's easier to avoid people.
Yeah.
Than it is to avoid people in Montreal. Like if you're living in an apartment building or something like that, and you go out onto the street, the city street, and there's a whole lot of people walking around. It's
yeah, there's a huge amount of foot traffic because Montreal's built so people don't need cars. So you're going to be walking by neighbors and all sorts of neighbors.
Yeah. So, I did feel some of that advantage in the last year with the pandemic. They had a curfew in Montreal.
I've heard.
Earlier this year, they just lifted it. They had a curfew because they said people were like going out and gathering and so on. But at one point, Montreal was doing really badly in terms of COVID. It was certainly worse than here. In the last few months, it hasn't done too badly. But I remember last year it was doing pretty badly.
Yeah. Well, it's hard with the old building. Like you said, the apartment buildings. And they're not quite like this apartment building where you have massive hallways. I've been in some apartment buildings in Montreal that are very cramped.
Oh, yes. Yeah, they have the stairs going up on the outside. And they have, well, it's a bit, the closest in Burlington is like, if the old North End is kind of packed together too.
Yes, there's definitely, I definitely felt bad for some of the roommate groups because they have 6-7 roommates in some of these places. And how do you keep track of 7 roommates needing to work? And, it just sounds like a nightmare. You'd just be trying to avoid each other in your own home. Mm-hmm. We need to ask one more question. Your favorite song that you've written?
I've written. Okay. Well,
I know you said you probably can't provide a single answer, but that's totally okay. Tell me which songs you like and why.
Well, on the first album, there were a couple of songs that I really liked. Well, I'll mention a couple. Perhaps, in terms of this, there's also the recording of it. Now, the first album that I did, I recorded with a friend of mine called Shane Watt. He's produced it. And it's probably the one that has the most alternative rock sound to it because he played a lot of the instruments on it, you see. So he played drums, he played electric guitar, he played bass. He's a very good bassist.
Nice.
He's also a visual artist. Anyway, he played, some keyboards and so forth, and it was actually in kind of a proper studio. So, but Carnival of Light, which opens the album, is kind of like almost like a cataclysmic beginning, and it's really, I love it, and it's actually got a bit of an early Pink Floyd feel. Although Shane compared it to Voivod. Voivod did a version of Astronomy Domine, which was a song from the first album. He was actually thinking about that version rather than the original. But I really like what he did with it, and Dreaming Again is also on that album, and for me, it's kind of one of my favorite songs that I've written just because it's kind of simple. Not necessarily in terms of like the chords and everything, but just in terms of like, it's a simple idea.
Right.
And,
there's a lot of beauty and simplicity a lot of the time.
Yeah. And so that's one of my favorites. There was an instrumental that I did a few years ago called To Get Away From It All. It's like in the middle of this album. I put some topical songs on it. And in the middle of it, I put To Get Away From It All. And that's just how I felt at the time. And it was like this floaty feeling. I was playing ukulele. I started playing ukulele, and so for some reason I retuned the ukulele and to make it easier because I was still learning how to play the ukulele because it's just different tuning from a guitar.
Yes.
Anyway, I just messed around with that and I did that, and then I just put melodica tracks and vocals. It's just like this ethereal thing.
Nice. Very cool.
And the melodica did this, I ended up doing this nice little melody on the melodica and floating all over it. So I rather like that one.
So what was your first album called? Sorry.
Awaiting an Awakening.
Awakening. And how many albums do you have?
So I went back to count and it's 13 now.
Wow. Okay. No, I don't feel as bad. I normally try and count it up first, but I got a little overwhelmed. I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I'm missing things. I didn't want to come up with a number.
There are varying lengths. Like one of them is only 6 songs long, so it's maybe more an EP. But yeah,
it still counts.
I've written a lot. I just write a lot, and then I put a lot of the songs that I write on. I just put them out because I just want to see what I can do with them. You see, so I just work at, or sometimes in the case of these instrumentals, like I've done most of the things I've done are like songs, but sometimes I just play with a musical idea and I build on it. So
right,
like with that one. And there was also another album that I did later that year. It was like 2017. It's called Imaginary World Tour 2017, and
I think I might have seen that one.
And it, there was like one, it kind of reminds me of Robin Hitchcock doing I Often Dream of Trains, that sort of thing. This sort of guitar with an odd tuning on it and playing around with it. So I don't know why in 2017 I was doing all these atmospheric instrumentals, but anyway.
It was a good time for it. Very soothing, relaxing.
Yes, it was May 2017 when I did put out the Interesting Time album. Really stressed for various reasons.
Hey, music's a good outlet for those things. So where can people find you online? Where do you want people to find you online?
Well, okay, so I do have a website called montrealpaul.com. I feel like I need to work a bit on it, but it is there. And people can find stuff through it. I also have, but my music is available on Bandcamp. So it's all online on Bandcamp. And again, you can search for a Montreal Paul there. You also mentioned SoundCloud. Now, for some reason, which I don't fully remember, I ended up changing my name on SoundCloud.
Yes, that's the third name, I think, because I didn't know what the name was.
Henri Naden. Naden is my mother's family name, but I spelled it differently. And then Henri is sort of a takeoff on the French spelling of Henri, which is one of my middle names. So. I think some technical hitch happened with SoundCloud, and it ended up changing the name by accident. And I just, it was a name that was kind of on my mind, right? So I ended up using that, and I just haven't, I haven't changed it to anything else since then. So it might be a little confusing for people, but that's.
It did still say a Montreal Paul, but
it still says other. So if you look for that on SoundCloud, you should still be able to find stuff. And so what's on SoundCloud is more like covers and things like that.
Right.
There are a few originals on there, but for the most part, it's covers. Which like I did. I've done some Beatles covers and Pink Floyd covers and other things that I just felt like doing.
They're good, yeah. I enjoyed some. I clicked through a couple that I recognized. I ended up on the SoundCloud, so I had to check them out. But it sounds like your Bandcamp is the place to go, though.
Definitely for the original music, Bandcamp is the place to go. And there's a lot to listen to if you want to. I mean, for sure.
Yeah, it's good to throw an album on.
Yes. So yeah, I find that I'm also getting more of other people's stuff on Bandcamp, when I can, for like independent artists. I like it. Not everyone is on it, of course, but
right.
But it's I find it's a good artist-centered place for accessing music.
Yes, they've definitely done. I think they've done really nicely for their musicians in the last year, because they waived fees a bunch of different times.
Yeah, they have like a once a month, I believe it is. Once a month they waive the fees that they charge, so that the entire purchase, revenue from the purchase goes to the artist. So it's that kind of a thing. And so I've been on Bandcamp since the first album. And online is basically how my music can be accessed now. I do have some copies of my first album somewhere.
Cool.
But it's just printing copies is a pain.
And in this day and age,
you don't necessarily sell very many of them. So
true, very true. And now vinyls come back more so than CDs, to the point where,
and vinyl, it's a very expensive proposition.
Yes,
certainly if you want to buy it, and definitely if you want to sell it, because
to get your own album printed is not cheap.
I mean, it's interesting that vinyls come back. There could be a whole discussion about that.
Oh yeah, I actually had a random aside, but I had Justin Crother from the Burlington record plant on the show. They're printing vinyl in Burlington.
Oh, nice.
It's a bit insane, though. I didn't realize how few of those places there are. He said there was only a couple dozen in the whole country that are still doing it. And they're all completely slammed right now.
Yeah, well, the thing is that, so vinyl sort of almost stopped because there was virtually no demand for it. I remember there was a time when I would go into a used record store and buy them really cheap.
Right.
Because people were getting rid of their old vinyl records. The idea that it was a prized thing was...
Oh, yeah. No one thought that back
in
the early 2000s.
The CD was king. But now, vinyls have made a comeback, although it's relative because so much has now gone into streaming. I mean, basically, when it comes to... Basically, the latest I've heard is that when it comes to album sales, vinyl has overtaken CDs in terms of money made from it, not necessarily in terms of copies, because if you go to a record store and you compare the price of a vinyl record to the price of a CD, you'll see a big difference.
It's $20 at least for a new record, but you can get CDs for like $5 for a brand new CD now.
Yeah.
So the cost has definitely shifted, but for me, I would much rather own a vinyl album because you get the artwork and it's something you can hold. And it's...
Oh yes, well that is the thing. That's one of the main advantages of vinyl, of course. It's a bigger format. So, and especially with things that originally came out in vinyl, the trouble with CD reissues quite often is that it was like so condensed, the artwork. So that,
it was ruined. I don't have any CDs from when I was a kid. For one, the CDs all got broken or smashed or scratched or whatever. You dropped it once and it would crack, whatever it was. And then the album art, well, like you said, is so tiny that it wasn't exciting. You can almost display albums on a wall and have it be beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's a store in Burlington that does that.
Right. Yes.
They do that. Well, there's at least one. Of course, the music, one of the record stores has them, the covers in the window, but also there's like a restaurant, like a fast food restaurant. You go in there, and they have like a display of old Woodstock era LPs.
Sorry.
It is very much from that era, like what they've got up there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's probably all stuff that was, buy it on eBay that was scratched or damaged. It makes good artwork if you can't use it anymore. It's better if you can just listen to it, though. But we could ramble for hours about this one, but I want to thank you, Paul, for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Go on to Bandcamp. Go on Bandcamp. Look up A Montreal Paul, and you will find Paul's music and stream some of those albums. They're interesting. They are definitely pretty cool. What did you call it? Freak folk?
Freak folk, yes. That's one of, or psychedelic psych folk or something like that. That's
psych folk. I like that. That seems a little better than freak folk. Reminds like raving. I think folk, psychedelic folk. That's more up your alley. I think.
I mean, there was like people were comparing what I did with like the Incredible String Band and with Neutral Milk Hotel, neither of which I hadn't really heard either of them. I didn't totally get it even when I did, but I can sort of hear it a little bit. But it's hard. You can't make an exact comparison.
Very true. That's true. In all directions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of the episode. You can check out the show notes at vermonttalks.com/25. And you can check out Paul's website at amtlpaul.com. And that's what's new in the 802. Thanks for listening. The Vermont Talks show music was created by Jason Baker. Thank you so much, Jason, for making the music. You can check out his website at jbakervt.com.